formalism that would give absolute credentials to text itself, and nothing was out of the text. In formalism, in semiotics, and in structuralism, in all of these, the autonomy of text could be the greatest, maybe, privilege that a critic had to take into consideration when he or she was going to study the text and was going to have a critical insight into it. So, but this is something quite new, and that is the autonomy of, not the autonomy of text, but the relationship, interaction between text and the reader. So for this reader response criticism, of course, the material that we need are two. Actually, one of them is the reader and the other is a text. And there is an interaction between these two, and that is a quite active interaction that enables the reader to be able to derive multiple meanings based on his own personal engagement with the text. If you remember, we had affective fallacy and you know, the other emotional fallacy, affective fallacy, and what was the other one? We had two fallacies. So they would stand in the way of readers, you know, multiple communication with the text. So this is another departure that we want to go through the reading in order to activate the text. Intentional fallacy, yes, thank you. So here, of course, we do have both of them. We do have intentional fallacy and affective fallacy as the you know, prerequisites for rendering a reading of a text. So this is quite on the contrary of what we had in you know, given before in formalism and in the new criticism. So, but the study of this approach that was first propounded by Schleiermacher. He was a German, a 19th century German philosopher and you know, Bible study scholar who had offered multiple interpretations of the Bible. So, but the thing that was not quite welcome that time was that he was maybe sort of afraid of talking about the variety of meanings of the Bible, because he thought it could be maybe a kind of prosecution against him. Yes, I'll write it for you here. And that is the maybe new paradigm based on which all of these you know, readings became possible. So that person was this person. I will just send you the name. So Schleiermacher was quite aware of the possibility of different meanings that somebody may derive from a text. However, when he was going to discuss the idea of interpretation of the Bible, he was a bit cautious, and he to avoid, you know, maybe some dangerous preoccupations later with the case, he decided to say that the Bible can be interpreted in different ways, but that is only one interpretation, one meaning of the Bible that is you know, absolutely valid, and we should look for that. So this is the first generation of hermeneutic. We can call them hermeneutic scholars, or hermeneutics means the science of interpretation, or reading texts and giving interpretations of them. So this is, of course, it was in the middle of the in the middle of the 20th century that Hirsch and some other people started talking about the realization of the text based on multiple interpretations. But here, there was something is still missing, and that was the intention of the author, or what we call author's authorial voice. Authorial voice is the main intention of the text that an author probably had put in the text in order to enable people or the readers to decode it. So, but this deciphering, of course, requires maybe a wide range of possibilities and conditions that might, that might activate the meaning of a text. So just there is a connection between the text on the one hand and the reader on the other. But Hirsch, that belongs to the second generation of hermeneutics, would believe that a text may have multiple meanings, but it is important to us as readers to have access or to derive the meaning that was in the mind of the author. So for him, still, he was a bit different from what Schleiermacher had announced before. But he says that there are multiple interpretations. We should interpret a text in a multivalent way, but there is only one particular meaning in the text, and that is the text meaning that has been maybe targeted by the author. So we should find the meaning that was in the mind of the author. So, but it could be maybe some good idea, of course, if we were going to study the the ancient or antique text, that we require to know what exactly the writer was going to say. But in modern world, that everything is suffering, not suffering from, is enjoying actually, is enjoying interpretation and indeterminacy, postmodern indeterminacy. We do need a new system of reading, and that system of reading could be based on personal understanding of a text that may open new horizons actually on the on texts unraveling, so that the text is activated by as many as people that read it. So here, I'm departing from the theories of Hirsch and Schleiermacher, modern or third generation hermeneutics like Gadamer would believe that there is a quite well-established connection between the text and the reader, so that the reader can can contemplate on the text on the basis of his or her conditions, like sexual conditions, political conditions, his religion, his age, his economic conditions, and all of these could be an amalgam of different circumstances that generate a matrix of reading policies. So this is, I think, the most important achievement that the third generation hermeneutics came to, in order to give more and more credentials to texts. So this is something that is by, do you know Louis Rosenblatt? Well, Louis Rosenblatt used to discuss the transaction between the text and the reader. So for her, I mean, for the reader response critics, two important things are very canonical. One of them is the role of the reader is that the role of the reader cannot be omitted from the understanding of literature. So without reader, no literature exists. The second thing is that readers do not passively consume the meaning presented to them by an objective literary text. Rather, they actively make the meaning and they find literature themselves. So this is quite important. That before this period of the 1960s, all readings were based on the autonomy of text, as I told you before. So, but hereafter, the text is part of the process of reading. So if you want to be a good reader, you need to interpret text based on your own personal and social and, of course, political and religious inclinations and circumstances. So this is a kind of interaction that requires both of these conditions to be realized to receive the message or meaning of a text. Well, actually, they pay attention to both of them. We need a text. A text has definitely a context. So, but the context does not mean those ideological or historical maybe events that had maybe stimulated the generation of that text. For instance, you should just put aside all of those historical elements in the text. If you want to read a Shakespeare's play or Shakespeare sonnet, you do not need to know what happened in the time of Shakespeare, but you should know what you are reading now. You are a historical reader. So you should have your reading derived based on your today's situation, not based on the historical context of the story. But by context, if you mean the context that you are just living now in, well, that is right. You just do need that context. However, every text is a kind of concrete entity that should be, connected successfully to the present context of the reader's life. Okay, so but it was actually for the first time, it was Louis Rosenblatt who theorized the ideas of transactional response theory. Believed that, well, this is something that she has put, that feelings, associations, and memories occur as we read these responses influence the way in which we make as we go or move through it. So this is maybe a quotation that should be quite easy to us, because the text, I mean, this quotation would show how our mood could be unraveling in the course of reading a poem or a work. Definitely, this is a very well established condition to may contribute to building the poetry. So actually, do you know what aesthetic reading and FR? Actually, we do. We have nothing to do with the background of the writer. The writer is dead because when we read it, as Roland Barthes says, when we read a text, the author dies and the reader and text are both born. So just don't go through this. Do not, attach yourself to this false idea that the background of writer could be important to us. No, the background of writer is not important to us. The thing that is important to us is our particular conception of the text that should be different from others. Yes, but for her, I mean for Rosenblatt, there are two types of readings. One of them is called, um, actually, she calls it aesthetic reading. Aesthetic reading is a kind of reading, efferent reading and aesthetic reading. Efferent reading actually uh, is a shallow reading of the text that does not give us a framework, a deep framework based on which we can go through the details of the story. So it is a kind of informative understanding of the holistic, you know, of the holistic narrative. So it does not go deep into the details and interpretations of the story or of the text, whatever it is. So efference is not going to be the focus of because the efferent reading does not provide us with any mode of understanding that may lend itself to our deep recognition or recognition, we can say, of a text. So that is not efference that may lend it. So, but the aesthetic reading is a kind of reading that allows the reader to dwell into the depth or probe into the depth uh, of the text, and of course will allow us to experience a personal connection, a personal relationship with the text, and focus our attention on the text's, unraveled maybe parts. So if you want to say that I want to read a poem or a shorter story, based on reader response criticism, you distinguish your aesthetic reading from efferent reading, because the aesthetic reading is what you need, and efferent reading will not give you anything but a handful of uh, uh, rudimentary discussions and maybe elements that should not be so useful for your multiplicity of interpretation. Okay, so actually there are some other theories related to the idea of reader response criticism or the approach. One of them is by Wolfgang Iser. So Wolfgang Iser and Robert T. were two leading figures in Germany who developed and effectively contributed to the development of reader response criticism. Iser would believe that there are two kinds of meanings in a text. One of them was determinate and the other was indeterminate. So from his point of view, determinate meaning, this is, I'm reading from a book to you. Determinate meaning refers to what might be called the facts of the text, certain events in the plot or physical descriptions clearly provided by the words on the page. So it means that it is yeah, determinate and indeterminate meaning. So determinate meaning, as Isa says, that the person is Wolf and Isa. He believes that the determinate, well, actually, if you want to compare, determinate meaning is not that different from Rosenblatt's efferent reading, actually. So that is a strategy of efferent and aesthetic reading that is, I mean, related to the practice of reading. But here we have a deeper context, and that is the context of meaning. So from Rosenblatt, that is the theorist of the strategy of reading, we go to the meaning itself, and that is the theory of Isa, and so we just talk about it later. So determining meaning refers to what might be called the facts of the text, certain events in the plot or physical descriptions clearly provided by the words on the page. So here we understand through the determinate meaning that that the surface, that is the surface of a text, and the text, of course, these parts are not interpretative at all. So if you say that maybe if you read maybe some parts of a poem about nature, about I don't know, about a spring, you will see that part of the poem just determines some information to us, shows us some information about the beauty or about other things. But this part of the poem is not interpreted, and this part to our better understanding of the meaning of the poem. But the things that may help us understand the text based on a new reading is the idea of indeterminate meaning. So indeterminate meaning or indeterminacy refers to gaps, actually, in the text, such as actions that are not clearly explained, or explanations which allow or even just to create their own interpretation. So this is, the dynamic of the text that maybe provides a very, a very strong and powerful instrument to the reader to be able to create his own interpretation. And these interpretations should be derived from the gaps, from the words that have not been told, from the lines that have not been written, or from the scenes that have not been described. So always there is a gap in a text, and that gap is the exact locus from which you should derive your meanings. Okay, so again, let's go back to the article. Hirsch discusses some very important ideas in this piece of writing. So in this article for Hirsch talks about subjectivism of the act of reading. So by subjectivism, definitely he means the same, static reading that could be the basis based on which the credits that we give to a text are realized. In this part, in this article, actually, Hirsch discusses the move from objectivity of the text that was, as I told you, informalist readings, informalist approaches, subjectivity of the reader. So this transformation was objectivity to subjectivity, was definitely the revolution early decades of the mid decades actually of the 20th century. So because this caused the this ability of of formalist approaches, just like Russian formalism, neo-criticism, and of course semiotics and structuralism. Okay, so let's see. We have understood the article. Is there anybody wanting to talk about this article? Any ideas, please? Yes, Raza Muhammad. I have unlocked you.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
The most important issue, according to Hirsch, is not the state of literary study as the vitality of literature, especially of older literature. The text should speak to the reader, should speak to us. The point which needs to be grasped clearly by the critic, is that a text cannot be made to speak to us until what it say has been understood. This is simply a print onto logical fact. Textual meaning is not necked, given like a physical object. The text is a conventional representation like a musical score, and what the score represents may construct it correctly or incorrectly. Thank you.
You're welcome. But when we discuss the correctness or incorrectness of a text or our understanding or interpretation, we definitely need also to think about the possibility of indeterminacy, because as Hirsch puts it, subjectivism, of course, is a type of experiment actually in reading that may or may not lead to a valid interpretation, but that is not the point, because when it is our task to derive a particular meaning from a text, the text should be quite unraveled to us in a way that we can derive a particular meaning that is assigned by the reader, but not essentially the thing that could be in the mind of the author. So, however, this is maybe the mistake, not the mistake, maybe methodological error that happened to Hirsch and his followers. They would believe that this subjectivity of text should finally come to the objectivity of meaning. However, objectifying a text, even if it is in favor of deriving a meaning from that, could not be that favorable, because definitely we never know why and what could be the repercussions of such readings. So this is, I think, quite important to know that Herschel's strategy for theorizing the idea of interpretation based on subjectivity of the reader could be maybe applicable to the subjectivity of the meaning itself too. So it means that it is not necessarily essential for the reader to read a poem or maybe a piece of literature subjectively in order to derive the objective meaning in the mind of the author. So this is a problem that was solved later by the third generation of hermeneutics, just like Gadamer, as I told you. They tried to unleash the reader and his mind from all restrictive policies or restrictive maybe conditions that may sacrifice the subjectivity of a text for the objectification of the meaning that had, that had been probably latent in the text. Yeah. So that is the point. Anybody else? Hmm. Yes, Muna Muhammad Hassan. I have unlocked you, Mona. Go on. Yeah, what happened? Hmm. Okay, it's no problem. Anybody else? Okay, so um, according to reader-oriented criticism, we also have some other discussions left, and of course, we should go through them very briefly. One of the ideas that you should have in mind when thinking about reader-response criticism is the discussion of the methodology, that how you should, under the influence of a reader response criticism, read a piece of work. So here, first of all, there are some thinkers, in addition to Wolfgang Iser, like George Poulet and Hans Robert Jauss and Roman Ingarden and Gaston Bachelard. All of these people have some ideas associated with the structure of the text, not physically, but I mean the psychological structure of a text that can contribute to our multiplicity of reading. So this is, I think, a kind of philosophical approach that realizes the necessity of phenomenology as a tendency that accents actually on the activeness or conscious activeness of the active consciousness actually of the reader or the perceiver. This is, of course, the first systematic study of human understanding. Just had been developed by Immanuel Kant and then by John Locke in the 18th century. So, but it was actually the active consciousness of the reader as a philosophy that was theorized by Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher and theorist. So, and there are two other things that I have to add here, and one of them is the idea of a reception theory that, of course, includes horizon of expectations. Do you know what it is? It was offered by Hans Robert Jauss. What is horizon of expectations? Do you know what it is? Horizon of expectation is part of the policy of reading that should embrace all of the possible historical periods through which a text had gone to reach us. So it means that horizon of expectation is a kind of experimental practice that should be relevant, of course, to the literacy and the critical thought and critical capability of the reader. So, for instance, if you want to read a poem from another period, it is necessary for you to see how a text had gone through the ages, and how we can relate those ages and their ideologies to the text itself. So horizon of expectations actually is a measure for the assessment of the text on the basis of the points that we derive from a text, historically and of course culturally perhaps. So the horizon of expectations is, to put it simply, is the historical consideration of the text, and it will be an inclusive process that allows the reader to have access to all of those forces or maybe impetus that change or develop the course of history. Yes. Okay, and of course, as Bressler says, Wolfgang Iser differentiates two kinds of readers. The first is the implied reader, what he says, who embodies all those predispositions necessary for a literary work to exercise its effect. Predispositions laid down not by an empirical outside reality, but by the text itself. Consequently, the implied reader has his or her roots firmly planted in the structure of the text. So there is another form of the reader, and that is the actual reader. The actual reader is the person who physically picks up the text and reads it. So actual reader is definitely a level below the implied reader, because actual reader is actually the subject that has access to a text, which is a clear-cut entity that has been produced, reproduced, and circulated and recirculated in the course of history because of some, maybe because of a variety of historical and cultural changes. So that is, I think, the actual reader that lends itself to just, a normal reading of the poem or of a work that does not go beyond the interpretative process. Yes, so and of course we do have another type of the reader, and that is the ideal reader. The ideal reader is a reader who is in the mind of the author. So the author definitely always has a pre-established image in his mind, or because when he wants to write something, the author definitely concretizes his poem or his work in his mind first, and then he materializes the text when it is written on a page and just printed out off and then comes out. And then the person who is reading it is going to be a person who is the most ideal and the most relevant and most talented, you can say, reader that the author had in mind when he was going to write it. So that is I think, imaginative, we can call it, reader that does not exist, because the reader, I mean, the ideal reader is a type of reader that the author had understood to be the person who is going to read the poem, the work later. However, this person may not exist sometimes, so that is kind of, idealized, we could say, active reading that is fulfilled and completed by the ideal reader. Okay, so let's talk about the article itself now. So the whole thing that we want to derive, yes, Zahra Hudan, may unlock you. Okay.
Good morning, sir. My voice is clear.
Yes, please, go on.
Actually, about the article, about the, let's say, objective interpretation, there are these terms. We have the term criticism, which, if you want to find out the commentary on textual meaning, it actually reflects general acceptance and between, I mean, the description and evaluation. Between these two terms, we have got the acceptance. About talking about description and evaluation, which are, we cannot separate them. They are inseparable in our literal study. And when we come to the term creativity, we have to, I mean, we can argument them for some terms. For example, for in terms of ethnical, cultural, or aesthetic viewpoint. But if I about the criticism, the same kind of theory is here, which argues the inseparability of description and evaluation, which says and also argues that a text's meaning is simply its meaning to us today. That we have got both kinds of arguments which support this idea, and the interpretation in criticism is actually vice versa. But about the distinction between interpretation and criticism, as we have in our lesson that we go through some different approaches in criticism and interpretation here. In this article, it talked about different kinds of, I mean, subjective and objective interpretations. And as I learned from last session, that we had got two kinds of interpretation, that the intentional and effective one. But here, if we want to talk about the distinction between interpretation and criticism, there is a central rule, there is a principle in when we are talking about science of hermeneutics. In the hermeneutics, we have to actually consider this term, and we have got the name August Boich, if I'm not wrong, for example, that he divided this theoretical part of encyclopedia into two sections, and one of them was devoted to interpretation, I mean hermeneutics, and the other one to critique. And he actually, his discussion was said that this distinction is it is illuminating, and he said that the interpretation is actually the construction of textual meaning, as such as it implicates that those meanings, and only those meanings which the text explicitly or implicitly actually represents. And he also says that criticism builds on the results of interpretation. I inferred that first there is an interpretation based to our religious, our I don't know, our before let's say skills, and our wisdom and our philosophy, because philosophy itself is the art, wisdom of art, and wisdom of love of wisdom is philosophy. And so criticism builds on the results of interpretation, and it also sees confronts some textual meaning, and even according to a larger text.
Mm-hmm. So, but what about the intention, actually, of the author? So this is something that has been discussed by Hirsch in his article.
Yes, right. I get that intention can be, according to our interpretation, that first something we interpret from the text, and then we have to maybe build a kind of criticism, or we can talk about, let's say, hermeneutics. But actually, this is my interpretation, maybe.
Yes, but so this is, of course, a kind of distinctive element in the work of Hirsch that differentiates him from the third generation of the hermeneutics. In this article, Hirsch, insists that despite the possibility of multiple meanings or derivatives of a text, the reader should look for the final intention of the author. So, because he believes that the what he calls meaning experience is an experience that is always meaningful when the intention of the author is sought and derived. So, however, later this idea was rejected, and definitely the empirical readings of the hermeneutics could enable the reader with a vast arena in which they can derive a variety of meanings without the concern of having these ideas relevant, or we can say originated from the ideas or the mentality of the author. So here, on page 469, in the middle of in the first paragraph of the second column on the right, we read this very important line of the article, that the interpreter's job is to specify the text horizon as far as he is able, and this means ultimately that he must familiarize himself with the typical meanings of the author's mental and experiential world. So that is, I think, the most important derivative that we can say about the intention of the author, that is to be the final fulfillment expected from a reader. Okay, so wait for some seconds. I shall come back in a moment, please. Functional reading, horizon of vision, active reader, implied reader, ideal reader, and now terminology of reading, determinate, and determinate meanings. So you should just look for these if you want to probe more into the active reading, the way that the activation of text happens in the course of reading. Well, that one is actually active. It is a wrong mistake. So also, related to subjective criticism or subjectivism of reading, we do have some critics like Norman Holland and David Blake, who have some ideas about identity theme and collective meaning that, of course, we have nothing to do with them, but you may just want to read them for yourself in order to increase your knowledge of reader response criticism. Okay, everybody. If you have any questions, please ask me. Or if you want to add something to my words, please do that. Otherwise, this is the end of our session today. Okay, have a nice day.